Welcome to the Reel to Reel podcast, where the stories behind the board go on record. I'm your host, Bruce Hensel, and we're here to give you an insider's look at the music industry. I'm joined by my co-host, Drigo, from the Melrose Center, and this month's guests, Brad Sundberg and Chris LeBrain. We're in several separate locations, including the audio studio in the Melrose Center at the Orlando Public Library. First guest today is engineer, audio and video systems designer, storyteller, Disney enthusiast, husband, father, all-around good guy, Brad Sundberg. Hey, Brad.
You left out maker of ginger tea, but I think you covered everything else.
Was that a new thing with the COVID?
No, I started drinking ginger. I'm still addicted to caffeine, but I started making ginger tea about a year ago, and I'm strongly addicted to it. So
wow, that's great.
Good to see you guys. Thank you for having me.
Brad, why don't you start off and give us a short little history of your career, and then we'll let Chris give us a short little background of himself, and then we'll dig in deeply to your history, Brad.
Sure. Happily married guy, 4 beautiful daughters. I got involved in the music industry in 1984, which sounds much longer ago than it feels. Moved to LA, worked with some pretty unique people, left the industry officially, I guess, in about 97-ish, and been building music systems, recording studios, home theaters, and doing some teaching and seminars for about the past 10 years. Oh, and now I live in Orlando, Florida.
Well, I think that makes it a majority here in this route.
There you go.
Yeah. Do you have any like cool studios that you've helped build and stuff like that? Anything that kind of sticks out?
I mean, that I'm not at that level of a Tom Hidley kind of. But I built several studios for a gentleman by the name of Rod Temperton, songwriter extraordinaire. So I actually built about 4 studios for him. One for Quincy Jones, one for Will Smith. And I guess those would be my notable ones. Kind of home studios.
Yeah. That's kind of like where things are going right now. Everybody wants a home studio.
Yeah, we were doing it. I guess the first home studio I built would have been in the early 90s, something like that, mid 90s. Probably Quincy, ironically, was my first one.
Yeah.
But I'd been around studios so much, I just took everything that we did in the real studio and shrunk it down. I just kind of kept doing that same format for a handful of clients.
Cool. Very cool.
Well, Chris, why don't you introduce yourself real quick before we gang up on Brad here?
No.
Well, I'm trying to think where to start. I guess from the beginning, right? I was born and raised in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Lived there until I was about 23. Moved to Orlando, Florida, like in 2004, and went to Full Sail. So that's what brought me here.
Nice.
Yeah, which was a great experience for me, meeting a lot of cool people, getting to do a lot of cool things. After that was over, I jumped into the Orlando music scene with my first band, The Aristocracy. And then from there, it was just a systematic me bouncing from different band to different band after that band was over. So ended up playing with Family Gang and Unit Shifters, and eventually hooked up with Kaylee Baker. And that lasted for a little bit. And then recently, 2 projects have come into my life, which is Universal Funk Orchestra, which I play drums, and Chris LeBrain's Campaign, which is my own band, which I kind of play everything except for a few instruments. But so it's more of a solo project sort of thing, but kind of a duo. And other than that, I host a radio show on WPRK, Anything and Everything Above Ground and Underground, which is on every Friday night from 7 to 9. I've been doing that since 2007. And other than that, just hanging around Orlando as usual.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Good for you.
Well, Brad, I wanted to see if we could dig into in the studio with MJ a little bit.
Sure.
I had the privilege of being invited by you to one of them. I guess it wasn't a full blown program in November at
Right.
former BJ studio.
Yeah.
And I must say I was very impressed. I don't think I'd seen a more in-depth, fascinating presentation by any engineer producer than that. So
Wow. You're very kind, Bruce. Thank you.
you bet. Why don't you explain a little bit about what you do with that?
Sure. Let me go back in time just a little bit to get you
Sure.
to how it started. And I'll be as brief as I can. 1984, I got my first job in a recording studio in LA called Westlake Studios. I went to a little recording school that's long since gone out of business called Soundmasters. So I'm a huge fan of recording schools. I know people have different sides of the fence on that, but that gave me the basics. Got a job at Westlake. I worked at Westlake for one reason. This is going to be really corny, but hang on. Because of this, because of an album by Michael Jackson, and not to brag or anything, but this one just happens to be signed also. But that's cool.
Strategically signed.
I know. It just it's a prop. But I wasn't a huge MJ fan. I was a Thriller fan. I loved the sound of Thriller. And that got me hooked. Westlake was the studio Thriller was recorded at. That's where I wanted to work. Michael started working on a project called Captain EO for Disney. I'm a Disney guy. And we just became friends. So I worked with Bruce Swedien. I became Bruce's assistant for many years, his technical director, he called it. Fast forward through the Bad album, the Dangerous album, the History album. I mean, I could go on hours and hours about those. Quincy Jones Back on the Block. And then Michael started having me build personal systems for him. So I built music systems at Neverland. I built music systems for his video shoots, one thing after another. So and this was when Napster came along and the music industry sadly was tanking. And I grabbed the brass ring and jumped out and started my own company building music systems in LA. Did that for many years. 2004, I kind of lost contact with Michael. That's a story of its own. He was having some financial problems, if we're going to be honest. And by the way, I stand with Michael 1,000,000% in terms of the insane accusations and things like that. I've written articles about that. But in 2009, Michael passed away. I hadn't seen him in 5 years. 2011, some guys in Paris found me and came to Orlando. I actually met him at Bruce Swedien's house. And they asked me if I'd come to Paris and tell some stories about working with Michael. And that was 10 years ago, this coming August, I think it was, of DAT tapes. And we booked a studio for 12 hours. There were about 15 people there. And I would tell stories, and it was emotional, and I would play a song, and it would spark a memory. And it was entirely unscripted and random. And they loved it. And I loved it. And so we started something called In the Studio with MJ. And it's just a hobby. These are some of my little posters behind me. But for the past 10 years, I've been to, I guess, 25 countries, and we've done close to 215 events, something like that. During COVID, of course, it crashed. So I haven't done much of anything, maybe 5 events in the past 2 years. But we're ramping it back up again. The big one is an 8-hour immersive. It's made for fans, and it's people that don't understand recording and how we used to make records. And I take people very thoroughly through 3 albums, play some tracks they may not have heard before, play some stripped down tracks, and tell stories. And then what you came to, Bruce, I call an evening in the studio with MJ, which is kind of a shrunk down more of a bite-size approach. It's about 3 hours. For me, it goes by like a finger snap, but it's the highlights of the big show. And I've been doing it for 10 years. I'm very blessed. I love doing it. It's a self-supporting hobby. I don't take it or myself too seriously. I just love telling these stories.
Well, I've got to say again, the presentation was great. The stripped down harmony vocals isolated was a highlight to me. I mean, that was one of those hair on your arms moments.
Oh, you're very
hearing
kind.
that in the studio. And the other thing is, the bottom end on those records is insane. It's the most amazing bass sound I've ever heard on anything.
Well, that's, and to be clear, I'd never take 1 ounce of credit away from Bruce Swedien. Bruce is in my opinion, one of the greatest engineers to ever walk the planet. I just happened to be there. I did some of the recording, but the mixing is Bruce or Bill Bottrell or Teddy Riley. And I got to work with some amazing people. Yes, Bruce's approach to bass is large. And on the Bad album, we used to use a GML 8200 parametric EQ, and he would run the dance mixes just through that EQ at the very end of the project. And we were boosting, I think it was 40 hertz at about plus 2.5, something like that. And there was already bass on the record, but he was pushing it just that extra mash a little bit more in there. And on some of the dance mixes, like Another Part of Me and Smooth Criminal and The Way You Make Me Feel, it's just thunderous.
Amazing. Yeah, that the GML is a great box.
I know it. I covet anyone that has one.
There were a couple in town. I'm sure I could track one down if you need it. So you guys got any questions for Brad?
Yeah. Speaking of the Bad album, which is by the way the very first record I ever bought with my own money.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, it was technically Christmas money, so it's Christmas '87, and yeah, it was like $6.99 on vinyl, and I still have it. Yeah. Drum machines. I'm a big drum machine head. Like, what drum machines, if you know, were used?
I know. Yeah, on the Bad album was the Akai. Help me out. Is it the? Oh, man, I'm embarrassed. Is it the 2600? Yeah. The kind of grayish one? I'm so embarrassed right now.
I mean, I think, because I'm having a hard time because I know they had a lot of products in that period. Like,
yeah, it was the first big one. Man, I'm really embarrassed. It had 16 pads on it. However, and this is the really important thing, the drum machine was an Akai. The MPC, I think the MPC 3000 was second generation. Was
it the 60? Was it the MPC 60?
MPC 60, yes.
All right.
Thank you. Okay, good. It was the MPC 60. However, and this is a huge however, Bruce Swedien, we would bring a guy into Westlake Studios by the name of the Drum Doctor in LA. And this guy had a warehouse of drums. Everybody used him for recording and for touring. And Bruce would basically say, bring everything. And he and I would do a couple days. I swear this is true. Mm-hmm. Where it was just the two of us. And he would set up all of the drums, all the snare drums, all the kick drums. And it was a big deal for Bruce to be the one to hit the drum. Bruce isn't a drummer, but he would place the mic, get the EQ the way he wanted it. Then I would record it and he would hit the drum. So the drums you hear on the Bad album are in fact very well recorded acoustic drums, but they were programmed on an MPC 60.
That's awesome.
Nothing was factory. Nothing was factory.
Was that Paul Jameson, the Drum Doctor? Was that the name?
Holy cow, that might be right.
Because when we were doing Hotel California, we rented every snare drum he owned.
Yes.
try out. And then Henley wound up buying 4 of them from him.
Okay. Wow. I think I don't remember the last name, but I'm 90% sure when you said Paul that rung a bell.
I believe that's who it was.
Nice guy. And yeah, that was so we did that on the Bad album. I'm pretty sure we did it again on Dangerous. And Bruce, remember in the late 80s, Bob Clearmountain released his drum sounds or whatever it was. And Bruce always wanted to do that. And I'm like, well, do it. You've got some of the baddest sounds of anybody around. And Bruce just never did. But yeah, all of our drum sounds were 100% acoustic, analog, if you will, recorded. And yeah, they were recorded to, I think we recorded them to his MCI 16 track. And then from there into the MPC 60.
Okay.
Yeah, that would make sense to get the tape compression.
So you get the tape compression and then grab it to the MPC.
Mm-hmm.
Deb used to, my wife, I've been married for 30, I got to be careful, 33 years, I think it is. And Deb used to call me, and this was before cell phones. And I'd be in the back of the control room at Westlake Studio D. And Bruce would be like editing those freaking snare drums. And I'm talking like 112 SPL, just. And she'd be like, he's doing drums, isn't he? And I just be like, yes. And it was just so loud. But he was a master. That's how he got those sounds.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, I'm
so happy the Bad album was your first album. So
it very much was. No, that album blew my mind top to bottom. Yeah.
This is not to toot my own horn. I tell this seriously with humility, but Michael used to call, when Michael sang bad, really, really bad, after he was done singing, he'd come into the control room and he would look at me and go, oh, hey, it's Brad, really, really Brad. And so he would call me, we all had nicknames for each other, but he'd call me, really, really Brad. And it's in the liner notes. So if you dig deep into your Bad album liner notes,
I absolutely will.
I'm kind of proud of that.
Hey, as you should be.
I just saw MJ the Musical on Broadway 3 weeks ago, and it's amazing. It's a really, really good show.
That's what I heard.
And I'm sitting there, and they did a couple of choruses of bad, really, really bad. And you can't say anything, but I'm just sitting there, kind of smiling to myself. Like, you know what? That brings back a really sweet memory.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah, it is.
Very cool.
Well, I've also, since you and I are friends on Facebook, Brad, have read a few stories about some interesting home installations you've done. You got a favorite you want to pick out and tell us about?
Oh, man. So the short version is, I think I mentioned my very first project. And again, I hope there's a bit of humility with this, but I'm in the studio with Michael during the Bad album. And that's when he bought Sycamore Valley Ranch, which you would go on to refer to as Neverland Valley Ranch. And he asked me to help him out. And he said, I want to put some music up there. And I had no idea what he was talking about. So my first professional installation ever was for Michael Jackson in his bedroom. And I put some speakers in the bedroom and he was all happy and they sounded good. And over the course of 8 years or so, I was working in the studio and I'm doing music systems for Rod. I'm doing them for Quincy. I'm doing them for Elizabeth Taylor, but I'm kind of shuffling between my two lives. And then finally, when Napster came and everything changed, I jumped ship. As far as a favorite system, we did so much stuff at Neverland. There was a reptile barn at Neverland. An entire barn just dedicated to reptiles, and it was gorgeous. Neverland was like no place you've ever seen. It was a really, really magical place. people didn't understand it until they went. And then it's like, okay, he did it for Make-A-Wish kids. He did it for himself, for his friends. But as part of Neverland was this reptile barn. It was way in the back of the ranch. And we had not a snake handler, an animal handler by the name of Brock. And I can't remember his last name. And he was a chain smoker, and he had, Marlboro voice. And I recorded him doing we did narratives about the snakes, about the reticulated python and the rattlesnakes and everything. And so when you went into this, I call it a barn, but it felt more like a really well-kept zoo. You'd go into this long hallway with the animal cages on either side, the reptiles, and you'd go to the rattlesnakes, or probably 20 rattlesnakes in a big terrarium behind glass, obviously, but you couldn't hear them. They'd flare up and start rattling and getting all pissed off. And Michael said, I can't hear the rattlesnakes. And so I'm like, well, I can fix this. So I actually built a very simple little, microphone, preamp, amplifier, speaker. And I hung a microphone in with the rattlesnakes. And so when people would walk up, the snakes would flare up, the rattles would start, and then you could hear them really clearly. Yeah. So, we did dozens and dozens of it was kind of my boot camp. Michael gave me permission and a moderate budget to put music on everything from trains to horse-drawn carriages. And it went on and on and on. So
that's
cool. Was it just to like just installing the systems to just listen to music, or was it for like any like specific monitoring purpose or something?
It was, number one, it was music. Have you ever seen like a rock speaker? You see them at theme parks and stuff. Yeah. We had like 400 rock speakers, and I'm seriously, I'm 5 years younger than Michael, so I'm like 26 years old, and I'm doing all this and figuring it out and learning about 70 volt and he trusted me. So we had music everywhere. We had birds chirping in the trees. We put bird houses in the trees with speakers in them. We had crickets coming out of different speakers. Lots, like I say, in the snake barn, you'd hear the little stories about the snakes and all that. So it was. And then we had Jumbotron. After the Bad tour, they parked Jumbotron, the big $2 million Sony screen. They put that in the theme park. And then I put a big JBL concert system on that. So it went on, and it was pretty amazing.
Very cool.
Very, very cool.
Right. So any more questions, gentlemen? You got any upcoming events, Brad, that
we do? I'm so excited. So in a typical year, we try to do 12 to 16 events, something like that. And then with COVID, we just had to pull it way back. But we're finally, everyone's just so sick of talking about COVID, and I'm so thankful the five of us are all in Florida. I feel bad for my friends in New Zealand and Australia and Canada, but we just can't wait any longer. So I just booked a studio today. We're going to be doing a 3-day weekend in LA in June. There's no reason you guys would be aware of this, but every June 25th is the day that Michael passed. And by the way, there's way more to my life than Michael Jackson, but June was when he passed away. And MJ fans from all over the world go to LA, and they go to Forest Lawn, and they go stand by the Star on the Hollywood Boulevard, but there's really not a lot to do. You might go see some MJ impersonator that's not very good. So we've started doing big events in LA every year in June, just to give people something to do. So I've brought in Steve Piccaro, I've brought in Bill Bottrell, I've brought in Matt Forger, Brad Buxer, Michael Prince. And so we book a studio. I take them through the event that you saw, Bruce. We also add to it really a whole weekend of events. So we just locked that down today. I'm going to start promoting it. Hoping to go back to London maybe in April, and I'm talking to a studio in Copenhagen in May. So
Great.
I can't wait forever, so that's
what studio in LA are you doing this at? Or you can't announce that.
No. I can say,
I know how that gets.
I can't remember. The guy just emailed me. Hang on. It's one that you probably haven't heard of. Gold Diggers. It's the old. Who was there was the film director not Ed Black.
Ed Wood?
Yes, it was Ed Wood's old studio.
Oh,
Thank
my
you.
goodness.
It's so cool. So they have a big screening room in the back. But you can rent it. It actually has hotel rooms and everything. So I've just booked it for that weekend. I've never been there, but I think it's, places like Westlake and Ocean Way. I mean, those are fun we did one event at Westlake. I love those guys. It's just so expensive. And it doesn't justify it for me to bring my band of lunatics in. I say that with respect. So I have to kind of find a little more out of the way kind of places. So this one, I'm actually going to Gold Diggers. I'm actually pretty excited about.
Great.
Cool.
Was Westlake was on Beverly, right?
Well, we had two. 8447 Beverly, and then one at 7265 Santa Monica Boulevard. So they were about 5 miles apart. So Thriller, Off the Wall and Thriller were at Beverly. Bad was at the Santa Monica location. And we did some of Dangerous at Santa Monica, but most of it was at Record One. And then History we did in New York at Hit Factory.
Great.
Cool. I do have a question.
Sure.
So with your studio building experience and stuff like that you've done, how do you kind of feel about like the growth of like immersive audio to like some new formats like Atmos?
Dolby Atmos. So it's funny, I'm building a Dolby Atmos theater right now, and that's why I was cutting it really close with you guys today. I love Dolby Atmos for movies. Remember when what was the format for CDs that was kind of surround? Was it SACD or something?
Yeah, I mean there was one called Quad that we had in the 70s.
Yeah,
it was essentially 4 speakers.
And then I've never been a big fan of surround music. Now, if it's a concert and you've got the audience and the whole thing around you, sure. But I used to buy some surround CDs. I'm not, or DVD music, whatever it was. And the horn is kind of, the horn section is behind you, and the snare drum is out of the. I don't dig it. I'm old school. I love 2-channel audio. My buddy Brian Viberts, 7-time Grammy winner, engineer, coolest guy on the planet. He's retrofitting his studio in LA for Dolby mixing, but he and I have talked about it quite a bit, and he's just like, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he's kind of like me. It's like, to really break a band apart and have stuff over your head and behind you, he's approaching very cautiously.
Okay. Yeah, no, for sure. Thank you for that.
Yeah, in terms of music, I really haven't heard a satisfying surround mix. I agree with you. It's a wonderful format for film. Unfortunately, I think we're going to see it pressed upon us in the future only because of the gamers. Because that's what they live by. And I don't know how much that's going to impact music, and I haven't been in the music industry in a while, so I really am not an expert on it. But that's my feeling. Is pretty much the same as yours. The interesting mixes that I've heard in surround were done as though they were the concert setting,
Right.
where there was a picture in front of you and the players were all in front of you, but the only thing behind you was the audience and the ambience of the music.
I mean, you guys, you're going to laugh at me, but I have 4 daughters, and more than half of them love Taylor Swift. And the Taylor Swift, I don't know if you watched it. I don't know, if it's your cup of tea or not. But her the Bad Reputation tour on Netflix, the mix on that is pretty spectacular, and we've cranked that more than a few times. It's very well done, so you get the whole immersive sound. But again, it's a live concert.
Right. Right.
You take Pink Floyd, and they, it's like the Beatles, and they keep, all right, let's do Dark Side of the Moon again. And a friend of mine, I built a theater for him, and he played me Dark Side in surround. I mean, it's cool, but it's not my cup of tea specifically.
What was one of your most difficult like studio builds that you've done?
I built a studio for Rod Temperton. This was several years ago. And in all honesty, I'm going to be totally honest. I don't build that many studios anymore because there's not a lot of money in it. I mean, I'm just being honest, because everybody can buy everything at Sweetwater, and God bless them. That's awesome. What the amount of recording capabilities that you can get for $5,000 is just mind blowing. I have to build theater systems because they're just better profit centers. But for Rod, I think it was the second studio that I built for him. And it was going into the south of France. It was going into his apartment in Cannes. And so I had to build the whole system in LA. I actually used my church. I got permission from my church to use a room downstairs. And I built the entire rig. Had to take into account power conversion because we're going from 120 volts or 115 volts to 230 volts. Had to pre-wire everything. I mean, I built the whole, and I mean, it was an Otari radar and a little Soundcraft mixer, I think a Ghost or something. But we still had to work all the bugs out. Then I had to crate it all up, weigh everything, do tariffs on everything, get it to France. And then I had 1 week to unbox it and make it work and train him how to use it. Not complaining at all, but it was a lot of late nights laying on the floor, soldering, and you can't go anywhere. When you're doing a job like that, you have to bring everything. It's not like being in LA or even Orlando where you've got a guitar center and, you can still run around and get parts. When you're in a different country, you just have to have everything pre-tested, and it's go time.
There's not that much room for mistakes.
No. And luckily, even back then, most of that stuff was pretty well built. And Otari Radar, I actually loved that format. I thought it sounded good. It was easy for a musician to use, and it worked out well.
Very cool.
There's still a lot of people using the Atari Radar systems too. Surprisingly,
is that right?
The ones that can keep them running.
I see them pop up. I mean, I'm not searching for one, but a lot of people, they've migrated to Logic and Pro Tools and different things. But there's something I like about having your recording equipment and then having your recording, whether it's a radar and almost keeping the two of them separate a little bit. But I'm old school, so I learned on a Studer 24 track. So what do I know?
Right.
So I have a question, a Michael Jackson question.
Yeah, fire away.
Just because I know this is kind of where you started with him, like, could you just in a nutshell tell me your experience, just a little bit of the whole Captain EO thing? Because, Yeah, that was one of the things that I bugged out about as a kid.
Are you an EO fan?
Yeah. I now unfortunately did not get to see it, at Disney at the time or whatever. Like I think MTV ended up showing it, so it was kind of unfortunate I didn't get to see the 3D and have the whole immersive experience. But yes, I kind of do a lot of research on Captain EO. So
okay. I've done a Captain EO event here in Orlando. I wish I would have known you then, but remember when EO came back and then it left again? Mm-hmm. So it was at Epcot. I mean, it's probably 4 or 5 years ago, something like that.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
And I brought Matt Forger out. Matt was the engineer for Captain EO, and I actually worked with Disney, and they actually opened the theater for us like 30 minutes early. It wasn't a big deal. And so I got to bring my group in and we got to watch Captain EO kind of as a private little audience. So again, when Matt was working on Captain EO, it was not Brad Sundberg. Let me be clear about that. Okay. I was running tapes back and forth to the sound stage, and I was in the studio. Matt Forger was the engineer. Chris Carell was the programmer with the synclavier. I hate when the names start to escape me. But there were only 3 or 4 guys. Well, John Barnes, of course, was he wrote most of the pop score, or stuff that Michael was doing. And it was my first. I mean, I have such fond memories because I was so new in the studios and I wasn't really in the room. I was kind of getting Michael, if they needed food, coffee, whatever. But I was kind of getting introduced to the team. Mm-hmm. And no, it was just the coolest thing I remember about that was being at Westlake Studio A on Beverly Boulevard. And it was a true 5.1 digital surround mix. That is the first digital surround movie ever made. Wow. Up until then, everything was called Dolby Surround. And it was just kind of a murky thing behind you back in the early surround systems. Captain EO was a true 5.1 digital recording. And so they built, I can still picture it in my mind. Matt had, I think, 5 Tannoy Series 10s, I think, in the control room and a subwoofer. And then he had a sidecar mixer just for monitoring. And for me to walk in and just see all this gear, I mean, I'm just a kid in a candy store. I'm like, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. But then, so Matt would mix all the music at Westlake in that cool little pod that he had for mixing. And then they actually brought him in to calibrate the rooms, calibrate the theater, both at Disneyland and Epcot out here at Disney World. I think they flew him to Japan to calibrate that one. And so it was as close for the audience to hear that mix. Kudos to Disney for spending the money to actually have the mix engineer come in and calibrate the rooms. So it was a good sounding. Those theaters sounded really good.
That is awesome. That's amazing.
At the time, I think to this day, that might still be one of the most expensive movies ever made per minute of film time.
Believe
it. I think it was close or possibly tied with the Terminator show at Universal, the Terminator T3 show.
Okay.
The original one that James Cameron did. Okay. I was working at Sound Deluxe when we built that room.
Wow.
And he was spending a lot of money. I mean, we had like 12 people full time on just editing on that.
Wow.
That's wow.
Yeah, when I do LA this June, I'm bringing Matt Forger in. And I love Matt. He's just the sweetest guy. And I hate, I'm not getting any younger either, but a lot of these guys are, starting to tick up in years a little bit. And I think it's good for them to share these stories. So we're probably going to do a very focused Captain EO. I'll play the movie and have Matt tell a bunch of stories, and MJ fans get a kick out of that.
Cool.
That's
Very good. Well, I want to thank you all for participating. This has been fun.
You guys are awesome.
Been great.
Thank you for coming.
You bet. Thank you for joining us on the Real to Real podcast from the Melrose Center. I'm your host, Bruce Hensel, joined by my co-host, Drigo. And I'd like to thank our guests, Brad Sundberg and Chris LeBrain, for being on this week's episode.
Thank you, guys.
Gentlemen.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Very much appreciated.
It was very great.
You guys have a great weekend. Good seeing you.
You too.
Okay.
Take care.
We have so much more in store coming up on future episodes. Make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube and follow us on your favorite podcasting app. Join us next month for another episode with another exclusive look at the life behind the board in the music industry with our guests Terry Binion and Davey J. Thanks to Carol Hensel for the theme music.
Thanks, guys. Be blessed. Take care.
Yes, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's take it easy.
All right, guys. Have a good weekend. Take care.
You too.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.